Hello and welcome to the United Commonwealth Broadcasting Company's Commonwealth series. This is Ted Yarbrough here to interview the author, Isaac Anderson, about his piece, The Commonwealth Past, Present, and Future, Article 2, History, Part 1, 1756 to 1815. How are you doing today, Isaac?
Very well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be back here.
Great. So, I guess just for our authors, for our listeners, why don't you, this is going to be explaining, I guess, a very important period in the formation of the Commonwealth, 1756 to 1815, with four major wars. And I thought that maybe we could run through, you could explain all four of the wars and the importance that they have towards the founding and creation of the Commonwealth.
Sure, that'd be great. Well, the first war is the 7 Years' War, beginning in 1756. A lot of it was very much a European war, but it developed into a major colonial war between Britain and Portugal on one side, the old allies, and France and Spain on the other. And one of the biggest theatres of the war were in Canada and in India. So this was the war to see who would control, who was going to be the primary colonial power. And the British strategy, led by Mr. William Pitt, later the Earl of Chatham, decided his strategy was to grant a lot of local power, devolved power to the colonies in America, the 13 colonies, Newfoundland, and also to the allies in India to try and make sure try and get them to fight the war for themselves. It would then, with British support, reinforcements were never needed. It didn't work that well at first because the French Canadians had a lot more military support, especially because that was before the Louisiana Purchase. So most of the United States, west of the Alleghenies, was also technically French as well. So it was surrounded on three sides. And it kind of failed a bit at first, but when the British supplied more and more forces, regular forces, and it won. What the notable thing about this war mainly is the fact that the strategy was based on self-determination. A lot of the colonies manned their own militia. A lot of them raised quite a lot of debt from that. And that would later affect, because once there's debt, there needs to be a government to raise taxes to pay for that. So self-government sprang from by that as well. Also interesting is the theatre in the West Africa and the Caribbean, where again the British forces defeated the French, capturing quite a number of the islands that would later be part of the UK, British Empire, and now the Commonwealth. Some of them are actually members of the Francophonie, the French one as well, so it's interesting to see how that tied together. So that's the first war.
Yes. Yeah, and obviously that, like you said, it had an immense issue in shaping who ruled where. And I think I guess the big issue from the next one then is how maybe this war ended up, and you brought up debt, led to the next big war, the American Revolution. And I want to talk about not only how that affected America, but also Canada and the Commonwealth in general. So why don't you explain to the listeners the impact the American Revolution had on the shaping of the Commonwealth?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, who's famously known as one of the founding fathers, also said that, "Believe me, dear sir, there is not in the British Empire a man who more cordially loves a union with Great Britain than I do." But the emphasis was on union. So the 13 colonies were in a union with Great Britain. They were not colonies. They felt that they were equal. So they were self-governing, they were self-taxing, and King George III was the king of each individual area. So they weren't under Parliament, but rather the legislatures in each of these colonies were the equal of Parliament. Now to Parliament this was completely unacceptable because they had just had a couple of hundred years of expressing their supremacy over the king to ensure that they were the top dog in the United Kingdom. So that really split, and the American patriots went completely over. They said that either a union or it was independence. Of course, famously they got independence. What was interesting was that a lot of the population were still Unionists, so they moved up to Canada. So this sort of instilled in Canada who they were. They were the Americans who wanted to remain part of a union with Britain, but they were themselves. They were Britons for sure, but they had a dual nationality and they were the equals. So this kind of really affected how the Commonwealth began to develop, because now you've got the British Empire now consists, or rather will consist, of a number of colonies with basic self-taxing, basic legislative and basic defence forces. And this was devolution on a scale much greater, or would be much greater than what we see in Scotland or any of the 21st century's devolution. So in that respect, it was really quite interesting how it continued.
Yeah, and obviously that, I think that, like you were saying, that's a very interesting point about you bringing up about loyalists moving from from the United States to Canada. And I think that would then bring us, and obviously we had 2 other wars, and we'll get to that effect on for the War of 1812, but there was a very big war in between the American Revolution and the War of 1812 that helped shape the Commonwealth, and that's, of course, the Napoleonic Wars. And I thought maybe you could bring up an interesting point. Like, I thought an interesting point in your article was about how they used wood made from Canada in the Napoleonic Wars. So I thought maybe if you want to talk about the Napoleonic Wars' effect on what would become the Commonwealth.
Sure, definitely. Well, the empire, consequently, despite what many people said, was actually beginning to be an economic burden on the UK in this period running up to the Napoleonic Wars. And of course, with the Napoleonic Wars, with Britain's allies on the continent being overrun, like the Dutch, and then very much later the Portuguese, Britain now was faced with puppet states springing up in these countries that claimed to have control of these colonies, but in reality were more or less Republican rogue states being backed by the full force, especially the military force of the French Revolutionary Army. So in that respect, once the French had more or less won the war, they established this policy called the Continental System. That meant that no country could trade with Great Britain, or they would be invaded by France. Now, as usual for Britain, what was vital for our national defence is the Navy, the Royal Navy. And the Navy in those days required wood. Most of the wood in those days came from Russia. And after Russia had been partly subjugated, or at least punished sufficiently not to provide wood to the UK, the only other option really was in the New World, and especially in Canada. Some reports suggest that some Australian wood came, but it was majorly from Canada. Between 1807 and 1809, Canadian export of wood to the UK increased threefold. So now Canada became not merely a colony partly for, well, we could see, oh look, more of the world is red than it is blue, but now became something that I think it's the first time probably the Canadians and the Commonwealth came to Britain's assistance and bailed us out from European continental tyranny, so to speak. So it was in that respect, and also the war affected Britain by Britain was majorly attached to India, and before the Suez Canal, the main way of getting there was around the Cape of Africa, which in those days was a Dutch colony, which explains why they're still the Boers, a lot of Afrikaans, Dutch language-based speakers in South Africa. So when the new Dutch Republican puppet state established by the French revolutionaries, it now claimed control of all the Dutch colonies, and it began to send forces down to the Dutch colonies to occupy them. So for Britain to have the major strategical position around the Horn to India, which provided a lot of the money and a lot of the economic strength, because in these days the only reason Britain could survive long enough was because it could stand offshore and it had the economic power to continue to fund forces against the French. So a French or Republican-controlled South Africa would have stopped this. So the British annexed South Africa. This went backwards and forwards with all the many peace periods of the time, but at the end of it, Britain now controlled South Africa. And that the relationship with the Dutch settlers was very much a rough one, very much one of the bad stories of British colonialism, along with the Opium Wars and the slave trade. But that's kind of how South Africa entered the Commonwealth, more forcibly than by free will. Or rather, what would become the Commonwealth.
Yes, and also during this time was the time that the slave trade was abolished.
Indeed.
During the Napoleonic Wars.
That's right. Towards the end of that, and it was abolished, and then the end of it.
So this was the time.
By all means, carry on.
Oh yeah, I was just asking. So during this time is when the British Navy really started to come of its own and help bring out the end of the global slave trade. Finally, now that we've talked about those three, let's go back to tie into our discussion of the American Revolution. Tell us about the War of 1812 and how it helped shape what would become the nation of Canada.
Yeah, sure. Well, at that period of time, especially following the American Revolution, a lot of people migrated from Canada to America who preferred a republic, and a lot of people migrated from the United States to Canada. So it really became a sort of a political balance between two groups who were very much opposed to each other on a sort of an ideological basis between Republicans, between monarchists. So when the war started up, especially based on the British use of the alliance with a number of confederated native tribes under Tecumseh, it created a war, and the War of 1812 is probably famous as one of the most unspectacular wars ever. Probably, I think it was both sides lost, but at the same time as both sides won, neither side could manage any form of cohesive invasion that lasted for very long. And it really, but what it meant was, to America, they began to feel themselves as we were the nation that defeated the British twice. So that really isolated themselves as outside what would become the Commonwealth. They were English speakers, but they were not part of the general British tradition anymore. Whereas in Canada, they viewed themselves as the nation that had defeated the Americans twice. They were francophones, they were anglophones, and they were natives typically. They were attached to the UK, but they were themselves as well. They had their own army. They even had, in the 1790s, they had their own navy, the Provincial Marine, which became the first the Canadian Navy. So it really sort of created Canada. Even still today, in Canada, it's known as the war that created Canada. And the War of 1812 is the second most defining factor in Canadian identity. So what it created was Canada was now firmly monarchist. And although they would want more local powers, they were not going to go the full step and go as far as the United States. They were going to achieve their goals through more peaceable methods, which really, hopefully, is what the triumph of the Commonwealth is about. It's ending oppression and ending inaccurate, bad rulership and out-of-date actions, such as colonialism, of course, by peaceful means, through discussion and through bilateral understanding of other people, which is hopefully what we shall continue to do.
Well, it's a very, very important time, and thank you for running us through those wars. I know it's discussed much more in depth if you'd like to read about it on the Daily Globe website, dailyglobe.co.uk. And like I said, the title of the article is The Commonwealth Past, Present, and Future, Article 2, History Part 1. And next week we'll be talking about the 19th century. And we really look forward to that, Isaac.
Indeed, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So until next time, have a good week. This was the second episode of the United Commonwealth Broadcasting Commonwealth series. Have a good one, Isaac.